Welcome to my channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. Listen carefully. My name is Marcus Webb, and I need to tell you something about the Trans-Alaska Pipeline that nobody else will, something the engineers don't talk about anymore. Something I discovered while monitoring flow rates for Alaska Pipeline Service Company. By the time this story ends, you'll understand why the pressure gauges tick differently at midnight, why maintenance crews request reassignment, and most importantly, what happens when you find out the pipeline isn't just moving oil south, it's moving something back north. Now, the story begins. I took the job because Anchorage was suffocating me. After my wife left in 2019, the thought of staying in Seattle felt like drowning in old memories. The Alaska Pipeline Division offered decent pay, remote monitoring stations, and something I didn't expect, isolation. Not the kind that hurts, but the kind that heals. My station was 70 miles north of Prudhoe Bay, where the tundra stretches so flat that your eyes hurt trying to find the horizon. The facility was small, just a control room, 2 monitoring stations, and a bunkhouse. I was one of 4 technicians rotating in and out monthly. The readings I collected were routine: oil viscosity, temperature, flow rate, pressure. Everything fed into the main servers down in Valdez. I'd spent 2 weeks in training learning the systems, and they seemed straightforward. Move the oil from the northern oil fields down to the refineries. Simple. Except, on my 3rd week, I noticed something odd. The flow direction indicator would occasionally reverse, just for seconds. A blip that shouldn't happen. I reported it to my supervisor, Dave, who laughed it off. Old equipment. Webb. Happens all the time. The pipeline's been running since 1977. Glitches are part of the package. But it didn't feel like a glitch. I started logging these anomalies in my personal notebook, not official records, just observations. 3 times a day. The reversals would occur at random intervals, sometimes an hour between events, sometimes 12 hours. The pattern made no sense. Until it did. I realized they occurred during specific weather conditions, when the temperature dropped below 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and only when the wind came from the north, from the direction of the Arctic Ocean. One evening, while I was reviewing the data on my screen, the lights flickered, just once. The facility hummed around me, that low electrical vibration you feel in your bones. But that flicker meant something in the backup generators. I went to check. The generator room was warm despite the brutal cold outside. I could see my breath, but only barely. As if something was heating the space from within. The generators looked fine, humming steadily, but there was a smell, metallic, like blood mixed with iron and something chemical I couldn't place. I didn't stay long. That night, I couldn't sleep. I'd read somewhere that isolation can make you paranoid, make you see patterns where none exist. Carl Jung wrote about the psychological torment of long darkness, the way the mind fills silence with its own creation. Maybe Dave was right. Maybe I was seeing things that weren't there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the pipeline was trying to tell me something. I spent the next week documenting everything more systematically. I created spreadsheets with timestamps, weather conditions, barometric pressure, wind direction, solar activity, everything. Because if I was going to convince myself this was real, I needed data, cold, objective facts that couldn't be dismissed as the ramblings of an isolated man. The reversal pattern strengthened. It became undeniable, every night between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. When temperatures dropped and the northern winds swept down from the Arctic, the flow indicator would spike in reverse, for anywhere between 3 and 7 seconds, like something was trying to push the oil backward, trying to reclaim what had been taken. I even considered the possibility that it was deliberate, sabotage. But who would sabotage a pipeline in one of the most remote locations on Earth? And why the specific timing? Why only at certain temperatures, on a particularly brutal night, when the wind chill hit minus 60 degrees? I made a decision that I can't quite explain. I suited up in the heavy weather gear and walked out to the nearest pipeline segment, about a quarter mile from the facility. The wind was howling. It sounded almost like language, like something trying to communicate across the frozen wasteland. I put my gloved hand on the pipeline. The metal was cold. Of course it was cold. But there was something else. A vibration, subtle, almost imperceptible, like a pulse, like the metal itself was alive and breathing. That's when I heard my name, not shouted, whispered, carried on the wind. Or maybe not on the wind at all, maybe inside the wind, as if the sound was woven into the very air itself. Marcus. I stumbled backward. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst through my ribs. I ran back to the facility. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely key in the security code, but the sound had been real. I wasn't imagining things. Something had spoken my name. My second month brought a new rotation mate, Thomas, a guy in his 50s who'd worked the pipeline for 18 years. He was quiet, professional, and immediately strange. On our first evening together, I mentioned the flow reversals. Thomas went very still. He set down his coffee slowly. "Don't talk about that," he said. "Just like that. What do you mean?" I asked. "Dave told you to ignore them, so ignore them." He turned away and wouldn't look at me for the rest of the night, but I couldn't ignore them, because the reversals were increasing. What started as 3 times daily became 5, then 8, then constant stuttering pulses, as if something was fighting back, pushing against the flow of oil trying to move south. I wanted to ask Thomas more, but he avoided me. He'd spent hours in his bunk, even during his shift. I'd cover for him while he lay there, staring at the ceiling. One afternoon, I found him in the equipment room, just standing, looking at the pressure gauges, not recording anything, just staring. "Thomas, you okay?" I asked. He didn't answer for a long time. Then, in 1994, the pipeline was shut down for emergency maintenance. Something blocked the line up north, something that shouldn't be blockable. He turned to me, and I saw genuine fear in his eyes. They cleared it, got it running again, but everyone who worked that maintenance crew, none of them came back for a second rotation. "What was it?" I whispered. "They never said. Official reports called it mineral sediment buildup." He made quotes with his fingers. "But sediment doesn't cause reversals. Sediment doesn't have intention." Before I could press him further, the alarms went off. The sound was unlike anything I'd heard in the facility, not the usual flow alerts, but something deeper. A low-frequency wail that made my teeth ache. Every alarm on the console was screaming red. Thomas ran to the controls. His hands moved with practiced urgency. The northern checkpoint, the pressure's spiking. It's spiking from inside the line. In all my training, I'd been told never to let it exceed 1200 psi. We were hitting 30-50, 40-40-50, 40-50-50. The pipeline was being pushed from the inside, like something was pumping its way south, not oil, something else. I watched Thomas's face. He was whispering something, under his breath. A prayer, maybe. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the pressure dropped. All at once, every gauge fell to 0, and the facility went silent. We stood there, breathing hard, staring at screens that showed nothing. "We report this," I said. "We call Valdez. We tell him what happened." Thomas looked at me. His face had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "No, we don't. You report this, and you'll be like everyone else who knew too much." "What do you mean, like everyone else?" He walked to his bunk without answering. The next morning, he requested emergency transfer. His replacement arrived via helicopter. A woman named Sarah, new to the pipeline, cheerful and oblivious. She didn't know about the reversals or the pressure spike, and when I tried to tell her, she looked at me like I was losing it. Maybe I was, but I had questions now, real questions. Thomas had mentioned 1994. That was 30 years ago. Surely there would be records, documentation. Something that hadn't been scrubbed from the official databases. Late one night, when Sarah was sleeping, I accessed the facility's archive server. It was supposed to be restricted. But the security protocols were older than I was, within minutes. I was downloading maintenance records from the 90s, and there it was, June 14th, 1994. Emergency maintenance order issued for the Prudhoe Bay segment. The reported issue was pressure anomaly and flow obstruction. A team of 12 engineers was dispatched. They worked for 72 hours straight. The records noted that they encountered biological material in the pipeline that couldn't be identified. Biological material, not oil, not sediment, but something that was alive, or had been alive. The report was classified immediately after, but whoever filed it had left fragments of data, mentions of thermal signature and moisture content inconsistent with known organisms, and most chilling of all, evidence of organized movement. One of the engineers on that team was named Dr. Michael Garrison. I found his contact information listed in an old company directory. He was based in Fairbanks. I called him. It was risky, but I had to know. When he answered, the first thing he said was, "Who gave you my number?" "I found it in the pipeline records. The 1994 maintenance team." There was a long silence. Then, "You shouldn't have found that, and you shouldn't be calling me. I'm a technician at Prudhoe. I'm experiencing the same anomalies you encountered. I need to know what you found." Longer this time. "Meet me in Fairbanks tomorrow. There's a coffee shop called the Steaming Cup on College Road. Come alone. Tell no one." He hung up before I could respond. I told Sarah I was taking a personal day. She didn't care. I caught a supply helicopter heading south and was in Fairbanks by noon. Dr. Garrison was sitting in a corner booth when I arrived. He was in his 70s now, thin. His hands trembled slightly as he held his coffee cup, but his eyes were sharp, haunted, but sharp. "You're Marcus Webb," he said. "Not a question. How did you?" "Because I've been waiting for someone like you to call for 30 years. He gestured for me to sit. I couldn't talk about it then. There were NDAs, threats. They made it clear that discussing what we found would result in, let's say, professional consequences. But you need to know. Someone needs to know. Before it's too late." He told me everything. The maintenance team had been dispatched because the pipeline pressure was fluctuating wildly. The initial theory was equipment malfunction, but when they opened the pipeline to investigate, they found something that no one had any category for. It was a living organism, or multiple organisms, clustered together, moving through the pipeline like it was water. It was dark, amorphous, with structures that resembled cells, but cells of impossible size and organization, and it was warm. Despite being in the middle of the frozen permafrost, it was generating heat. "We took samples," Dr. Garrison said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "We tried to preserve them. We had them analyzed in secret labs. And what we found, Marcus, what we found violated everything we understood about biology." "What was it?" I asked. "We never determined exactly what it was, but we determined what it wasn't. It wasn't bacterial, not fungal, not viral. It wasn't any known classification of life, but it was alive. And it was old." Carbon dating suggested this is what they tried to keep classified. Carbon dating suggested it could be anywhere from 10,000 to 50,000 years old. My coffee grew cold as I listened. The permafrost has been preserving this organism, maybe for longer than humans have existed in this part of the world. And then we started the pipeline. We started pumping oil, creating pressure changes, heat, vibration. We essentially woke it up. "What happened to the samples?" I asked. "They stopped growing once they were separated from the pipeline, from the oil. It was as if the oil was feeding them, sustaining them, and when we tried to destroy the samples, they fought back. The containment vessels cracked, the samples dissipated, like they were evaporating. But not really evaporating, more like they were transforming, returning to a state where they couldn't be detected." I felt the blood drain from my face. "That's when the company got involved." Dr. Garrison continued. "Real serious people, government people. They took everything, all the research, all the samples. They made us sign documents that essentially made us bound by silence. They told us that the pipeline would continue operating because stopping it would draw too much attention, too many questions. So they decided to manage the problem. Manage it how? By letting the organism feed, by understanding its life cycle, by studying it from within the running pipeline where it couldn't be removed or examined or understood by anyone outside the company. They created protocols, ways to monitor it without alarming the public. Ways to ensure that the oil flow continued while the organism thrived in its new habitat. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because the organism is growing. It's not staying dormant anymore. For the first few years after 1994, it was almost quiescent, slow. The pressure reversals were minimal. But starting around 5 years ago, they started accelerating. The organism is learning, it's adapting to the pipeline, and it's starting to push back, to try to reverse the flow, to try to return to the source." He leaned across the table. His trembling hands gripped the edge. The pipeline wasn't built to function in reverse. The pumping stations, the valves, the entire infrastructure. It's designed for one direction only, but if something inside it is strong enough, persistent enough, to reverse the flow, the consequences would be catastrophic. The pressure points could fail, the pipeline could rupture, and if it ruptures, if all that oil spills out along with whatever's in that pipeline, we're looking at an environmental disaster that would dwarf Exxon Valdez. "We need to report this," I said. "We need to go public, alert the authorities." "To what end?" Dr. Garrison asked quietly. "The authorities already know. They've known for 30 years. The only reason they let us live, let us have jobs, let us exist, is because we kept quiet. And you're about to have the same choice." He stood up, placed a $50 bill on the table. "Go back to your station, finish your rotation, document what you're seeing, but don't tell anyone, don't send emails, don't make phone calls, just observe. Because you need to understand what's actually happening before you decide what you're going to do about it." He walked out before I could respond. That night, I couldn't sleep. I didn't even try. I took the first helicopter back to the station. Sarah was reading a book when I arrived. She asked if everything was okay. "Fine," I told her. "Family stuff." The lies came easier than I expected. My final 2 weeks at the station transformed completely. I stopped thinking of the reversals as anomalies. I started thinking of them as communication, as a learning process. I reviewed every piece of data I could access, and a pattern emerged, a clear, undeniable, terrifying pattern. The organism was learning the pipeline schedule. It was timing its pressure reversals to coincide with specific oil delivery cycles. It was studying the system, testing its boundaries, finding weak points, and it was growing stronger. The pressure spikes increased. The reversals lasted longer. And then, on day 41 of my rotation, something changed. The flow didn't reverse. It stopped completely. Every gauge went to zero. The entire pipeline, from Prudhoe Bay all the way to Valdez, suddenly held no pressure, no flow, nothing. Sarah and I stared at the screens. "That's impossible," she whispered. "The pipelines never just stopped. Call Dave," I said. But before she could, the alarm started, not the pressure alerts, but the environmental sensors, the ones that monitored the ground around the facility, and they were all registering the same thing. The permafrost temperature was rising, not melting, rising, in coordinated sections along the entire length of the pipeline. The frozen ground was warming. From the inside, from deep beneath the surface, and then the pressure started rising again, but differently this time. The main gauge started climbing, but so did the satellite gauges. Every checkpoint along the pipeline, north and south, was showing increasing pressure simultaneously. "That's not possible," Sarah said. "The pipeline can't build pressure like this. There are pumping stations, there are valves. You can't just pressurize the entire system at once." But something was. The pressure climbed higher, higher than I'd ever seen it. 1900 psi, 1900, 1900, 1900, 2000. The needle was pegged. The system was overclocked. And the alarms weren't just sounding anymore. They were screaming. I ran to the window and looked out at the pipeline. And I saw something that I still have nightmares about. The metal was moving, not visibly, but there was a distortion. Like the pipeline was rippling from the inside. Like something massive was pushing against it, testing it, probing for weak points. That's when I understood. The organism wasn't trying to reverse the flow anymore. It had moved beyond that. It was trying to break free, to return to the surface, to escape the pipeline and reclaim its place in the Arctic. Sarah was on the phone with Dave. Her voice was shaking. "The system is overpressurized. We need to vent. We need to release pressure or the line's going to rupture. Don't touch anything." Dave's voice came through the speaker. "Calm. Too calm. Let it stabilize. Dave, this is dangerous. We need to..." I said, "Don't touch anything. Monitor and report." He hung up. Sarah looked at me. "What do we do?" I was already moving toward the manual override, the emergency pressure release system. I had the access code. I had the authority. All I had to do was punch in the numbers and release the pressure before the pipeline failed. But I hesitated, because if I did that, if I released the pressure, what would come out? The organism, released into the atmosphere, free from its 50-year-old confinement, returning to its source, spreading across the Arctic like a fog. And if I didn't release the pressure, the pipeline would fail, an ecological catastrophe, billions of gallons of crude oil spilling into the permafrost, the Arctic ecosystem destroyed, and possibly worse, the organism escaping through the rupture, spreading across the tundra. Either way, we were facing an environmental apocalypse. I was reaching for the override when Thomas's voice echoed in my memory. If something that old, something that deep, something that's been sleeping for millennia, finally learns how to use our technology against us, what do we do then? The pressure gauge suddenly dropped, all at once. Every reading plummeted to zero. The alarms cut off abruptly, and the facility went completely silent for about 3 seconds. Then the external alarm started. The one that meant structural failure. The pipeline had ruptured. We couldn't see it from the facility, but the seismic sensors registered it. A rupture approximately 8 miles north. A massive breach in the main line. Oil and whatever else was in that pipeline was pouring into the Arctic. Dave was back on the phone within seconds. "Secure the facility. Issue a Level 3 environmental alert to the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. This is now an official pipeline rupture incident." "Should we report what we observed?" I asked. "The pressure fluctuations, the anomalies." There was a pause. "File a standard equipment failure report. Note pressure fluctuation possibly due to seasonal temperature changes or material stress. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable. Do you understand?" I understood perfectly. "Yes, Dave." The next 18 hours were chaos wrapped in bureaucratic procedure. Environmental teams mobilized. News helicopters circled overhead. Environmental activists descended on Prudhoe Bay like locusts. The narrative became simple: old equipment failure. The pipeline had been running for nearly 50 years, metal fatigues, failure was inevitable. Nobody asked about the pressure reversals. Nobody asked about the weird temperature readings or the seismic anomalies. The official report would show what Dave had described: equipment failure. Nothing more. Sarah and I weren't told we were being transferred. We were simply informed that a helicopter was arriving to pick us up. Our rotation was ending early. But on my final night, I did something that I've never told anyone. I accessed the sealed files. The ones that required advanced authorization codes that I shouldn't have had access to. But somehow, after Thomas left and I'd been covering multiple shifts, those access codes had been left behind. Accidentally, obviously. The files contained decades of data. All the monitoring records from 1994 to present. All the pressure reversals. All the anomalies. All the evidence that something unusual was happening in that pipeline. And there were emails, internal communications between the company and what appeared to be government officials, discussing the organism, calling it by a project name Arctic Echo. The emails indicated that the organism was thriving, that the pipeline had inadvertently created a perfect habitat. The oil wasn't just fuel, it was food, a nutrient-rich medium in which the organism could grow and evolve. But there was something else. Emails from more recent years, from the past 5 years, indicating that the organism was becoming something more, something with structures that resembled neural tissue, something that might be capable of thought, or, at least, something resembling thought. One email from 3 years ago, written by someone named Dr. Sarah Chen from the CDC, stated, "The organism is exhibiting coordinated behavior. The reversals aren't random. They appear to be intentional. The organism may be attempting to communicate or manipulate the system. We need to determine its level of cognition before this situation escalates beyond containment." Escalates beyond containment. That was the phrase that made me realize we weren't dealing with an accident or even a biological curiosity. We were dealing with something that the government had classified as a potential threat, something they were actively monitoring but hiding from the public, and they'd been hiding it for 30 years. I copied everything to an external drive. Sarah was asleep when I did it. The helicopter arrived at 6 a.m. We were airlifted out by 7. By noon, I was back in Anchorage. By evening, I was on a flight to Seattle. 3 months have passed since I left the pipeline. The rupture was contained. The oil spill was managed. The news cycle moved on. There were news stories about environmental impact. There were fines issued to the company. Everything was processed and filed and moved into the past. But I couldn't move on. I spent weeks analyzing the data I'd stolen. The patterns were undeniable. The organism was intelligent. Or becoming intelligent. It was learning, adapting, coordinating its movements with the pipeline system, and after my transfer, the pressure reversals hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd increased. The organism was continuing its work, pushing, testing, learning how to reverse the flow. I needed to tell someone. But who? The FBI? They'd probably arrest me for corporate espionage and stealing classified information. The press? I had no credible proof, just stolen files and the word of a guy who'd worked at a pipeline and heard strange voices in the wind. I reached out to Dr. Garrison again. He told me to sit tight, to wait, because he believed something was coming, a larger event, something that would force the truth into the open. He was right. 6 weeks after the rupture, there was another one, this time at a different facility. 300 miles south, at a different pumping station. The official explanation was identical, equipment failure due to age and stress. But it was the third location where the real truth started emerging. An independent environmental scientist, Dr. James Walsh, had been monitoring the Arctic soil chemistry as a side project. He noticed something unusual in the soil samples near the third rupture site, organic material that didn't match any known species. Material that had trace quantities of the same isotope ratios as the primordial rock formations that the pipeline traversed. He published a preliminary paper, not in a major journal, but online, in a university database. The paper suggested that there might be an unknown organism living deep in the Arctic permafrost, an organism that might be affecting the pipeline somehow. The paper disappeared from the university database within 48 hours. Dr. Walsh's funding was mysteriously cut. His university position was suddenly in jeopardy, but I'd downloaded and saved his paper, and it confirmed what I already knew. I started reaching out to independent journalists, environmental organizations, scientists who weren't beholden to the oil companies or the government. I told them parts of the story, not all of it, just enough to pique their interest, just enough to make them curious. And eventually, one of them, a reporter named Monica Torres from the Alaska Environmental Journal, agreed to meet with me. We met in a coffee shop in Seattle. The same kind of nervous atmosphere that I'd had with Dr. Garrison. But Monica was different. She was angry. She wanted the truth, and she was willing to take risks to get it. I gave her the stolen files. I told her the whole story, from my first week observing the reversals. To the conversation was Dr. Garrison, to the rupture and what I'd learned about the organism. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat back and said, "This is the biggest story of my career, but if I publish it..." If I say that there's an unknown intelligent organism in the pipeline, I'll be laughed out of the industry. I know, I said, but I believe you. And I think this is important. I think people deserve to know. She's been working on the story for the past month. She has sources within the government. She's filing FOIA requests. She's building a narrative that's factual, documented, and undeniable. When her article publishes, everything will change. The company will deny it. The government will deny it. Scientists will debate whether my interpretation of the data is correct. But the conversation will have started, and once it's started, you can't stop it. So here's what I need from you, if you've made it this far, if you've listened to this entire story. I need you to think about something fundamental. We've been extracting oil from the Arctic for 50 years, pumping billions of barrels to fuel our cars, our homes, our civilization, and in all that time, we didn't stop to ask what else might be living in those deep places. What other forms of life might exist in the permafrost, waiting, sleeping, for something to wake them up? The Alaska pipeline pumps oil south. That part is true, but it also pumps something north, something ancient, something that's been dormant since before human civilization existed. And every pump, every cycle, every pressure change is feeding it, helping it grow, helping it learn. And here's the question that keeps me awake at night. What happens when it becomes strong enough to reverse the flow completely? What happens when it forces all that oil back to the source? When it returns home, because I don't think the organism wants to escape. I don't think it's trying to break out into our world. I think it's trying to return to where it came from, to the deep places beneath the Arctic, to reclaim its domain from the oil we forced into it. And if it succeeds, if the pipeline reverses completely, what does that mean for us? For our power grids, for our transportation, for the entire infrastructure we built on the assumption that oil will always flow south? I think we're about to find out. Comment below. Tell me your theories. Tell me what you think is moving through that pipeline. Tell me what you think comes back when something that old finally gets strong enough to push its way home. Because the more of us who know, the harder it is to hide. And maybe, just maybe, if we understand what we're dealing with, we can figure out how to coexist with it instead of destroying each other. Thank you for listening all the way through. This story, this confession, it's been weighing on me for months. Getting it out feels like releasing pressure from a system that's about to rupture. If this unsettled you, if this kept you thinking even after you close your eyes, please subscribe. Please share this with people you trust. Please come back for more stories about the things we don't understand, the things that live in the dark places, the things we wake up when we drill too deep. Because there are other stories, other pipelines, other experiments that went wrong, other things in the deep that are starting to push back, and they're all sending the same message across the darkness. We're aware, we're coming, and we're learning how to use your own systems against you. The pipeline pumps both ways now, and I don't think we can stop it anymore. Good night, sleep well, and listen carefully to the sounds of the wind, because somewhere in that sound, carried across the frozen Arctic, something old is calling home. Thank you for listening.